Hello, good evening. I'm Toby Lett of the department here, Head of Creative Writing, and I'm just going to introduce now Jane Bryant from Winchester Poetry Festival, who's going to say a few words about the F.T. Prince Memorial Lecture, and then I will say a few more things to introduce our speaker. So welcome.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Faculty of Arts and Humanities to the 13th F.T. Prince Memorial Lecture. My name's Jane Bryant, and I am Chair of Trustees of Winchester Poetry Festival, who is a partner with University of Southampton in promoting the F.T. Memorial Lecture. As you may know, these lectures were named for F.T. Prince, the South African-born poet and scholar who helped set up the University of Southampton's English department some 70 years ago. His own poetry drew on everything from African kingship to urban graffiti, and our speakers over the years have been similarly expansive, from Isabel Armstrong describing the power of women's experimental poetry, or Malika Booker on writing poetry that speaks back to the Bible, or Dr. Anthony Joseph speaking about the connections between poetry and carnival. Winchester Poetry Festival is delighted and honoured once again to be co-presenting the F.T. Prince Memorial Lecture with the University of Southampton School of Humanities and the English Department's own Centre for Modern and Contemporary Writing. Winchester Poetry Festival runs a wide range of events and activities over the year, and that includes our International Winchester Poetry Prize, which this year attracted almost 2,000 entries from 33 countries. We have just delivered our major 2025 biennial festival, and we're delighted to have featured Dr. Mary Jean Chan, tonight's guest lecturer within the Poetry Festival programme. I know, therefore, that we are in for a great treat tonight, and I'm delighted that Dr. Mary Chan is giving this year's F.T. Memorial Lecture. And I'm now going to hand over to Toby Litt, Head of Creative Writing, to introduce them.
Thank you. Last time I instituted the, because I can do that as head of creative writing, I can institute things. I instituted the reading of something by F.T. Prince as part of this evening. And because of the subject that Mary Jane Chan has chosen to talk about, I thought something elegiac would do. So this is F.T. Prince's last poem. Stand at the grave's head of any common man or woman, Thomas Hardy said, and in the silence what they were, their life becomes a poem. And so with my dead as I know them, now in his and her long silences, and wait for yet a while hence my own silence. You can give F.T. a round of applause too. And I think he deserves that. So I first came across Dr. Mary Jean Chan's poetry when they were included in the Carcanet New Poetry's 7 anthology, which was published in 2018. It was immediately clear they were a poet who combined simplicity of language with complexity of thought and of emotion. There was a feeling in their work of restraint, but also of extreme intimacy. Their poems were an invitation to become part of a family that you didn't know that you already belonged to. These qualities in Mary Jean Chan's writing have developed and, in my opinion, deepened since their first collection, Flesh, and through their most recent collection, Bright Fear. They also co-edited with Andrew Macmillan the 100 Queer Poems anthology, and we had Andrew McMillan giving this lecture 2 years ago. I'm lucky enough to have read Mary Jean Chan's lecture, and I know we're in for something exquisitely thought, argued, and most of all, felt. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mary Jean Chan.
Good evening. I want to start by thanking Toby for that lovely introduction and to thank the School of Humanities for making this event possible. Thank you as well to all of you for being here this evening and for being here both in person and online. It is a great honor to be delivering this year's F.T. Prince Memorial Lecture, which I have titled Forms of Grief, Elegiac Writing and Stricter Poetic Forms. My approach today is not predominantly concerned with a theoretical discussion of the poetic modes through which contemporary elegies operate, nor am I suggesting that elegiac writing requires stricter forms to succeed. Rather, this lecture stems more from my own experience of reading and writing poems on grief. I am also thinking about elegiac writing in broad terms, along the lines of Jehan Ramazani's formulation of poems that rethink the vexed experience of grief in the modern world. It seems that I have always been writing poems about grief, since love and grief are merely two sides of the same coin. In other words, to love something or someone is always to experience the potential for loss. When my mother was in intensive care in Hong Kong back in January following a serious accident, I found myself turning daily to compressed and tensile poems as a source of solace amid the alienation of the hospital setting. One poem which spoke vividly to me consisted of 8 lines from a sequence called A Light Song of Light, written by the Jamaican poet, essayist, and novelist Kei Miller. A light song of light is distant cousin to songs we sing in bathtubs, is related then by accident to water and to soap and to square white tiles that bounce sound one from another, is related also to rain and to blankets and to the little things we say to get us through the hurricane. The little things we say to get us through the hurricane felt like a reminder of the power of linguistic brevity, how language under duress could become eroded to their essence and given form by endurance, to use a line borrowed from the poet Nancy Campbell. Over the years, my growing obsession with stricter poetic forms sparked a desire to understand how they can often prove liberating for the writer, not in spite of, but because of their poetic constraints. Across my 2 poetry collections, Flesh and Bright Fear, as well as in newer work, I found forms such as the sonnet, the specular poem, and the tanka enabling in terms of articulating complex themes of grief. I would like to start with the sonnet, a form which will be deeply familiar for many of you sitting here today. As a student of poetry a decade ago, I recall being captivated by poems such as Elizabeth Barrett Browning's Sonnets from the Portuguese, variations such as the Stretch Sonnet, extended to 16 lines or more, as exemplified in George Meredith's sequence Modern Love, as well as more recent examples, including Don Patterson's 40 Sonnets and Terrance Hayes' American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin. In his elegiac memoir, the poet Henri Cole describes the sonnet as a form I love, with its mixture of passion and thought, its infrastructure of highs and lows, its volta and the idea of transformation, its asymmetry of lines like the foliage of a tree over a trunk, and most of all, its intensity. This is brilliantly illustrated in one of Hayes's American sonnets, which I will read to you now. From American Sonnet for My Past and Future Assassin. I lock you in an American sonnet that is part prison, part panic closet, a little room in a house set aflame. I lock you in a form that is part music box, part meat grinder, to separate the song of the bird from the bone. I lock your persona in a dream-inducing sleeper hold while your better selves watch from the bleachers. I make you both Jim and Crow here. As the Crow, you undergo a beautiful catharsis trapped one night in the shadows of the gym. As the gym, the feel of crochet dropping to your floors is not unlike the stars falling from the pep rally posters on your walls. I make you a box of darkness with a bird in its heart. Voltas of acoustics, instinct, and metaphor. It is not enough to love you. It is not enough to want you destroyed. This is a sonnet which reverberates with the collective grief of being a Black American citizen during the first Trump presidency, when Hayes sought to write a sonnet a day during the first 100 days of Trump's first term in office. The I lock you refrain haunts the entire poem as it recurs. The American dream morphs quickly into an American nightmare. I lock your persona in a dream-inducing sleeper hold, the stars falling from the pep rally posters on your walls. The phrase Jim and Crow sonically recalls the Jim Crow era, during which racist laws were enacted in the southern United States, which enforced segregation and discrimination against African Americans. Violence abounds in this American sonnet that is part prison, part panic closet. Yet the volta becomes a surprising moment of tenderness where the speaker recognizes their own agency, which lies perhaps beyond the act of writing. It is not enough to love you. It is not enough to want you destroyed. In the words of Christina Pugh, sonnets incorporate the volta or turn, an often breathtakingly indefinable pivot that remains a vital component of the poem's structure. The lead up to this revelation is a transformation from containment to creation, as observed by Poetry Magazine senior editor Lindsay Garbutt, who notes on the magazine's podcast that Hayes repeats, I lock, I lock, I lock 3 times, and then it shifts to become, I make you both Jim and Crow here. I make you a box of darkness. Instead of locking things in, Hayes is creating. The enjambment of the penultimate line is also powerfully moving in its double meaning, for if we simply read the 13th line on its own, it would say, voltas of acoustics, instinct, and metaphor. It is not enough. Poetry during dark times like these is not enough. In the words of Adrian Rich, poetry isn't revolution, but a way of knowing why it must come. The poem doesn't offer us any easy answers, but it tells us that it is not simply enough to respond emotionally to a crisis. Somehow, we must find a way to break out of the sonnet and into a more capacious realm where action, or indeed activism, might be possible. My first experience of writing a sonnet felt deeply transformative, and is partly the reason why I've turned to it often in my creative work. 10 years ago, during a creative writing workshop in London led by the American poet Gregory Pardlow, participants were given a single evening, and the early hours if we so chose, to write a Shakespearean sonnet that had to encompass a memory or experience which previously felt too difficult for us to articulate. We were also encouraged to incorporate an image that involved some form of violence, be it emotional or physical. Pardlow suggested that the constraints of the sonnet, with its specific rhyme scheme, would ask us to focus our attention on the scaffolding of the poem instead of its contents, which would in turn enable our subconscious thoughts to emerge unhindered onto the page. The poem which emerged from that thought-provoking exercise was To the Grandmother Who Mistook Me for a Boy, published in Flesh in 2019. To the grandmother who mistook me for a boy. I had my fist in your mouth the day you nearly died. Minutes into our meal on Sunday, you slumped over and lay so still we thought you'd left us to deal with the grief you believed we deserved. To curse our bodies for denying us rare gifts of sons, despite offerings reserved for deities disdainful of another prayer. I wanted you to love me since mother gave a damn about what you thought of her, because amongst his brothers, father was your favorite. So I fought to keep you from biting your tongue, my fist in your mouth, your love for me a lie. This is a sonnet about many things, but amongst them is a complex tale of intergenerational trauma. I had known that my paternal grandmother's Alzheimer's during her later years caused her to create her own story of wish fulfillment by mistaking me for her beloved grandson. Yet the grief of my not being a boy, felt by my grandmother, and its subsequent impact on my mother, felt too nebulous and unwieldy for language. The fact that I had also been involved in saving my grandmother's life during a seizure, as my father, a doctor, instructed my 8-year-old self to place my right fist in my grandmother's mouth to prevent her from choking whilst he performed the necessary emergency procedures, further complicates this tale. In his essay, Making Space for Grief, Kei Miller writes, I thought about my mother, but there was no narrative, just overwhelm. Later, he observes, we writers are in the business of creating spaces for grief. There are not many people who do this kind of work, who are willing to face such bleak visions and write it down, and so we must. The Shakespearean sonnet, with its relentless rhyme scheme and limit of 14 lines, felt like a safe space within which to set down one version of the story, a means of containing the overwhelm. Writing this poem was a strangely meditative experience. I recall counting syllables long past midnight and aiming for the revered 10 syllables per line. In this case, I've settled mostly for 9, whilst pondering how I could rhyme something with day, having begun the poem with the day you nearly died, and wanting to keep the dull, alliterative effect of the D sound going. The scene became surprisingly intimate. In what felt like a concrete poem on the page, I was able to dwell on the granular details, which emerged largely due to the linguistic compression caused by the predetermined end rhymes. Whilst knowing I could draw on slant rhyme or even visual rhyme, full rhyme seemed to have the intended effect of emphasis, which in turn enabled me to accentuate the heaviness of the grief felt by the poem's speaker. In his introduction to Scanty Plot of Ground, a book of sonnets, published this year, Paul Muldoon observes that in broad terms, the Petrarchan sonnet seems open to discussion, whilst the Shakespearean sonnet sometimes gives the impression of a mind made up, perhaps inflexibly so. The final lines of my sonnet, in which the Volta yields a devastating emotional truth, to keep you from biting your tongue, my fist in your mouth, your love for me a lie, feels in keeping with this observation of a mind made up, partly due to the inherent violence of the image of a fist in the grandmother's mouth, with the word fist receiving extra attention due to the fact that I had no choice but to end the penultimate line with my to rhyme with lie in the final line. From a creative standpoint, the rhyme scheme here enabled me to find a fresh language for grief. In an interview, the poet Emily Berry discusses thinking about something the psychoanalyst Darian Leader calls a dialogue of mourning. The idea that traumatized people might use the words of other people when they find themselves at an unspeakable point in the narrative. Perhaps the architecture of the sonnet, which precludes the use of certain words over others in order for the rhyme scheme to hold, meant that certain words were in effect excluded from my usage, such that I had to make do with words and syntax I otherwise would not have chosen had I been writing a free verse poem. For the overwhelmed poet, this poetic artifice is deeply enabling, allowing what was previously unspeakable to finally be spoken. This leads me to another poetic form, a more contemporary one, that of the specular or mirror poem, invented by Julia Copus in her collection The Shuttered Eye, published in 1995. The basic tenets of a specular poem include 2 identical halves in terms of words on the page. The second half is simply the first half read back to front, from the final line back towards the first, but the only element which can be altered in the second version is the poem's punctuation. In describing her specular poem titled The Back Seat of My Mother's Car on the Poetry Archive, Copus writes, it describes the moment when a mother drives away from her husband for the last time, with their little girl sitting in the back seat. It is written in a new form called specular, after the Latin for mirror, because the second half of the poem uses the same lines as the first, but in reverse order, as if the whole thing is looking back at itself in a mirror. Here the car window acts as a reflecting device in the middle of the poem. This poem is spoken by the little girl. Just so I can clarify, normally the poem is laid out as a single run-on poem on the page, but for space reasons, I've laid it out side by side. So we'll start on the left and move over to the right for the second half. The back seat of my mother's car. We left before I had time to comfort you, to tell you that we nearly touched hands in that vacuous half-dark. I wanted to stem the burning waters running over me like tiny rivers down my face and legs, but at the same time I was reaching out for the slit in the window where the sky streamed in, cold as ether, and I could see your fat mole fingers grasping the dusty August air. I pressed my face to the glass. I was calling to you, Daddy, as we shrieked away into the distance, my own hand tingling like an amputation. You were mouthing something I still remember, the noiseless words piercing me like that catgut shriek that flew up, furious as a sunset, pouring itself out against the sky. The ensuing silence was the one clear thing I could decipher, the roar of the engine drowning your voice, with the cool, slick glass between us. With the cool, slick glass between us, the roar of the engine drowning, your voice was the one clear thing I could decipher, pouring itself out against the sky, the ensuing silence piercing me like that catgut shriek that flew up, furious as a sunset. You were mouthing something. I still remember the noiseless words, the distance, my own hand tingling like an amputation. I was calling to you, Daddy, as we shrieked away into the dusty August air. I pressed my face to the glass, cold as ether, and I could see your fat mole fingers grasping for the slit in the window where the sky streamed in rivers down my face and legs. But at the same time, I was reaching out to stem the burning waters running over me like tiny hands in that vacuous half-dark. I wanted to comfort you, to tell you that we nearly touched. We left before I had time. The problem with grief is that it often feels like a straitjacket, that it can become a story that takes on a life of its own with only one possible beginning, middle, and end. I'm reminded of these lines from Emily Berry's poem, The End, in which the speaker self-consciously evokes the experience of articulating a narrative of loss. At this slide, I told a story about my shame that got cold when the air touched it, then it got hot, throbbed, wept, attracted fragments with which it eventually glittered, till I couldn't stop looking at it. The specular functions in a similar manner of attracting fragments with which the poem eventually glitters, by inviting the writer to look at the same event twice, to in fact resist the urge to stop looking at it, such that it ossifies in our memory and becomes set in stone. In particular, the specular poem can challenge the temporality of an event by inviting us on a different journey through the same memory, as seen in the two readings offered by Copus's moving poem. The first half of the poem features the child remembering vividly that she was reaching out for the slit in the window where the sky streamed in. In the second half, she recalls the father's fat little fingers grasping for that slit in the window where the sky streamed in, thereby meeting in the middle. Later in the poem, it is the ensuing silence which was the one thing I could decipher, whereas in the second iteration of the poem, it is the father's voice that was the one clear thing I could decipher. Each line is a fragment of memory which coheres around the complex story of grief that is being told not once, but twice, perhaps revealing how, in the words of Sarah Howe, writing about one's past always involves this overlaying of imagination, memory, and distortion. Through the specular form, which requires the same words to be used whilst differently punctuated, the poet is nudged towards a form of recollection, and indeed rewriting, that makes this confluence of imagination, memory, and distortion apparent, which feels very truthful to an account of grief that may in fact have no clear or clean narrative arc. In grappling with similar themes of memory and myth, I wrote the following specular poem titled Hindsight, which is published in my second poem, Bright Fear. Hindsight. all the ingredients necessary for happiness. I grew up well fed, years away from conflict and its aftermath. When someone in the family knows sacrifice as the only currency, such knowledge seeps. History must suffice. My mother knew hunger. Bread, in the absence of a miracle, cannot yield more loaves. I will give myself the mango stone, save the sweet flesh for someone else. Save the sweet flesh for someone else. I will give myself the mango stone. A miracle cannot yield more loaves. My mother knew hunger. Bread, in the absence of history, must suffice. Such knowledge seeps. Sacrifice as the only currency when someone in the family knows conflict and its aftermath. I grew up well fed, years away from all the ingredients necessary for happiness. In her elegiac book, Knox, Anne Carson writes, "It is when you are asking about something that you realize you yourself have survived it, and so you must carry it, or fashion it into a thing that carries itself." Having written this specular poem, I realize I have indeed fashioned a set of feelings, thoughts, and experiences into something that does carry itself, like a tapestry whose multiple narratives have been woven into something more than the sum of its parts. Once again, this poem concerns history, memory, and myth spanning multiple generations. The poem asks what kinds of inheritances are passed on within families in the wake of war and conflict. The fascinating thing about these stricter poetic forms is that their poetic machinery almost becomes a second writerly hand, forcing the poet to edit themselves as they go along to make the conceit of the poem hold. Writing a specular poem requires that one flip the poem on its head as one proceeds. In this case, I wrote 2 to 3 lines, flipped the poem whilst changing the punctuation, all the while checking if both versions made sense and whether they were conveying what it was I wanted to say. At times, I had to change my choice of words or syntax entirely, or to craft line breaks I otherwise might not have chosen for the reordered lines to work in the second version. Rather wonderfully, such poetic constraints meant I simply had to look at the same story twice through revisions and repetitions. In the first part of this poem, where the speaker recalls the biblical tale where Jesus feeds a multitude of hungry mouths with several loaves of bread and a few fish, the mother's experience of hunger becomes one of lament for the speaker, particularly since the grandmother's Christian faith does nothing to ease their predicament. My mother knew hunger. Bread, in the absence of a miracle, cannot yield more loaves. Later, this observation becomes one about censorship and historical amnesia. My mother knew hunger. Bread, in the absence of history, must suffice. Emotionally, the conclusion of this poem continues the theme of what constitutes sustenance for the body and mind. Whilst the speaker begins innocently with the lines, "All the ingredients necessary for happiness. I grew up well fed, years away from conflict and its aftermath," the second reading offers a stark realization. I grew up well fed, years away from all the ingredients necessary for happiness. Hindsight was an example where none of these words would have been written without the specular form already in place, where it was in pondering the form's emphasis on looking at the same thing from multiple perspectives that a more complex and perhaps more compassionate story could finally emerge on the page. For the final part of my lecture, I would like to briefly explore the tanka, a Japanese poetic form consisting of 5 lines of 5-7-5-7-7 syllabic units, resulting in 31 syllables. In her collection, The Trees Witness Everything, the American poet Victoria Chang turns to wakas, that is the court poetry of the 6th to 14th centuries in Japan, encompassing principally the tanka, or the short poem, and choka, or the long poem, which can go on indefinitely. In one memorable tanka called The Sound of the Light, Chang writes, "I can't overhear light, can't stroke it or scratch it, can't turn it over. It's a lot like grief, which has ringlets of light streaked through it. In an incisive choka, Chang meditates on our inescapable complicity in ongoing wars in World's End. Will Earth stop spinning? Will there only be hair left? We are made of war. It stays in the air, mixed with oxygen, we breathe it in and deploy it out. Our birth is easy on us, but hard on everything else. These poems are doubly constrained as they are also titled after poems by the renowned poet W.S. Merwin as an homage to him. In Chang's words, I chose to doubly constrain myself because formal constraints often have the opposite freeing effect on my writing process. Terrance Hayes once said in an interview, my relationship to form is that of a bird inside of a cage, moving around. Movement is precisely what comes across in Chang's Tanka and Choka. Both poems grapple with personal and collective grief, aspects of which become sharper and more focused through the form's heightened emphasis on powerful imagery, alongside the need for precise language within highly compact lines. The repetition in Chang's Tanka of I can't, 3 times, emphasizes the futility of trying to go beyond the visual in comprehending light, since it can't be overheard or held, which in the penultimate line is revealed as being a lot like grief, as the poem unexpectedly pivots. In Chang's Choka, the poem's stark pronouncement that we are made of war is complicated by its concluding volta. Our birth is easy on us, but hard on everything else. In both poems, Chang turns the demands of linguistic compression into an opportunity for piercing insight framed by negative space, where much is necessarily left unsaid. The reader is instead invited to read between the lines and to exercise our own imaginative faculties in deciphering the various layers of imagery that build powerfully upon one another in the poems. I first came across Chang's work during the pandemic and loved her prose poetry collection, Obit, and her more recent book, With My Back to the World, but found myself returning to the trees this year, particularly when I found it nearly impossible to write in the wake of my mother's prolonged hospitalization for 7 months. During long days spent in the hospital ward, I found myself longing for a succinct way to articulate how grief and other emotions could commingle as life beyond the hospital continued to go on, and as the smallest sensations such as having tea with a close friend or watching the sea shimmer under sunlight provided me with a much-needed sense of reprieve. Over the past few months, I wrote the following tankas, linked by the image of the South China Sea, which surrounds Hong Kong on 3 sides. I am in the sea where childhood and memory began. I am home. A wave buds slow into time or autobiography. What freezes must thaw while sipping tea on a friend's couch with a view of the sea. I mean the serene undulations of her face. During days of grief, the sea is like sun leaning on a granite wall in the solemnity of autumn. Steady, steady light. In the latter 2 tankas, I attempt to capture more of the tanka's traditional appearance, which tends to be written in a single unbroken line. Somewhat akin to the sonnet, the tanka employs a turn in the 4th and 5th lines, which marks the transition from the examination of an image to the investigation of the poet's personal response, which need not be conclusive, but gestures at the open-endedness of an emotion such as grief, which, in Chang's words, has ringlets of light streaked through it. Since the tanka requires poets to lean on vivid imagery so as to convey something clearly yet efficiently, I felt freed to, in Emily Dickinson's oft-cited dictum, tell all the truth, but tell it slant. By dwelling on the image of the South China Sea, I was somehow able to urge my mind into writing through the anguish and overwhelm towards the still point, where, as T.S. Eliot observes, the dance of life is. Thank you.
Thank you. I hope you'll agree that was a very special lecture. So I'd like to start. I'm going to ask a few questions, and then it will be over for you. And then copies of Flesh and also Bright Fear will be available outside for sale from me. So you have no excuse not buying one or two. So I wanted to start by asking, do you feel you could have given another lecture at this point? It feels like it came very directly out of this year.
Indeed, I think this year was one of those moments where constraint was a very vivid topic in my mind, not least because the constraints were not just linguistic constraints, but they were, physical constraints in terms of time, in terms of energy. I was flying between Hong Kong and Oxford, where I teach, 6, 7 times, and caring for my mother as an only child, and yet trying to keep a kind of relationship with language and with poetry. And so really linguistic brevity was all I could manage in terms of reading and writing poems. I remember reading Kei Miller's poem when, my mother was still very ill, and I could only manage those 8 lines, and sort of repeating those 8 lines in my head, a bit like a mantra, something to hold on to during those very bleak days. And luckily, things have really improved since, but I think writing this lecture was both deeply sort of nourishing, but also, took a lot out of me, if that makes sense, because in a way the well has been half dry for a long time, and so that was all I had. But in that way that language replenishes us, I think it was, a timely thing that you invited me to do this.
I'm glad it came at a good as well as bad time. The kind of language you're attracted to in those moments. I mean, my partner's father-in-law spent a long time in intensive care, and what I mainly remember reading was Take a Break magazine in the waiting room, and which has its own terseness. But it seems that you are going for language which, while it is clearly distilling emotion and very expressive in some ways, is also not operatic. It's not singing loudly in a kind of Italian tenor feel sorry for me way. And there's plenty of poetry that has that sort of resource and would be an obviously kind of cathartic prompting towards something. So when you're reading that, is it that you're looking for that form of containment, or what are you looking for or finding in those poems?
I think I like the way you describe those poems as quiet in a way. I mean, I think Terrance Hayes's poem is very sort of angry and simmering, but of course it has its own quiet tone. I think for me, I found that I had no space mentally or emotionally for melodrama or for kind of proclamations that things would be okay. And I think Jehan Ramazani mentions that in contemporary elegy, consolation is not the aim. And actually, most contemporary elegy has rejected this idea of elegiac writing as being consolatory. In fact, it is trying to grapple with the complexity of grief as it is, and the messiness of it, and how often it is unresolved, and we have to live with it. And so how does one live with that ongoing sense of grief? And because in January I was not sure whether my mother would live, I was not able to sort of reach for things that felt conclusive. And so something like Kei Miller's The Little Things We Say to Get Us Through the Hurricane felt so apt, because I was in the storm still, as it were. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm very aware that Jamaica is in the middle of a hurricane
Yes,
at
of
the
course.
moment. So could we take the forms one by one and talk a little bit more about them? Because it seems to me that your Shakespearean sonnet, it feels like a breakthrough kind of poem to me, or at least I can imagine you sitting back at 2 a.m. thinking, wow, I've made that, and I wouldn't have made it without an external prompt. Now, obviously, you'd put yourself in that environment, but I would say as a tutor, to ask someone to write about something that they hadn't been able to write about before because it was a difficult experience, is obviously asking people to investigate their trauma, and then saying, do it through 14 lines, an Elizabethan form with a rhyming couplet at the end and a volta, all those kind of things. Off you go. But it clearly worked beyond maybe what the person setting that could have hoped for. But did you feel that the form itself of the Shakespearean sonnet did have that, what Paul Muldoon said was a kind of conclusive statement with the couplet at the end, or did you feel you were fighting against that?
I think it's very interesting because, when you write with form, you sort of have to go in a very sort of determined manner. You can't sort of try half-heartedly to write a Shakespearean sonnet. It's sort of all or nothing. So firstly, I did think that I wanted to write about this topic because when he mentioned the image of violence, I just had this flashback to having my, tiny fist in my grandmother's mouth. And that was actually a tender image. I was trying to keep her from biting her tongue, which literally keeping her from choking. But of course, there's an inherent violence in that. And then I was thinking back to how complex that image is and actually thinking maybe this would be a safe space. 14 lines, the poem has the end. And that literally was what I had in mind. The poem has the end. So there's an end to this difficulty. So I wrote the first line, "The day you nearly died." And I just thought, oh my gosh, I've started off on a quite an intense, sort of foot. But then I kind of kept going with it. And I think writing at midnight and everything and the way we were just told to go for it gave me permission to sort of investigate this. And honestly, I had no idea where the poem would lead. And I think that's interesting, is that even as I was working with constraints, there was a sense of the end rhymes that emerged made me say things I didn't think I was going to say. And so by the time I ended with, "Your love for me a lie," I had no idea that was where I'd end up. And yet it kind of was what I wanted to say, the complexity of being loved for someone who you're not, as a grandchild who's not a grandson. But she loved me, and I thought, wow, how complex this thing is. It's called love, right? And grief. And so, yeah, I think I didn't really fight the ending couplet. I found it very liberating. I was very pleased when I realized that "my" and "lie" was a full rhyme and that I could finally go to bed. Yeah, it was a long night, but I think my tutor was very pleased with it.
Yeah, goodness. And so the specular poem, which obviously in the Julia Copus version sets it's a horrendous read in lots of ways. That forces you to go through something twice, forwards and backwards at the same time. You sort of described how you wrote that, but was there something kind of preparatory to that, knowing that you were going to have to go if the heritage of the poem starts with a child, being driven away from their father, did you know that the territory it would bring would be traumatic or extreme, or do you think you could have written something kind of milder? Or
it's interesting. I think in hindsight, it actually is one of two speculars that I'm happy with. So I'm not expert at this form at all, but I knew I wanted to sort of look at the same thing twice. So I went in knowing that, in my poem at least, the second version is sort of the adult version. The first version is the child remembering that this is the story I'm told, or this is what I think I took from, my childhood. And the second version is the adult reflecting on it again. So I went in with this idea that, again, it was sort of a mixture of wanting to look at something, but then again, not knowing where you'd end up. And I find that very, as I described it as second writerly hand, it is quite enabling, because when something is so nebulous and sort of intergenerational and it's very broad, if it were a free verse poem, I just had no idea where to start and end. It would just become pages of me rambling all over the place. And I'm someone who likes limits, so I work also with prose poetry, and there isn't enough time sestinas. I love having a sense of this is the boundary within which you can freely roam. So the specular form was enabling in that sense, where I knew that also, because Julia Copus's specular is absolutely amazing, and the length at which it goes on, it means that when you flip the poem, it's even harder, right, to ensure that the second version makes complete sense going backwards. Mine is fairly short. So when I got to sort of 11 lines, I was like, I need to stop here because I can't control this anymore. Like, if I kept going, it wouldn't make any sense. So mine's sort of a slightly more timid specular, if you will, but I think I'm still happy with it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then with the tanka, which is obviously syllabic, but also is a kind of graphic image in the original, and we in English we do it as syllables and we count the syllables, but it's not quite the same. That clearly works through, and the heritage of it is externalizing something that stands for emotion, be it the moon, cherry blossom, whatever it happens to be. Did you feel that you were going for a more sort of forgiving form, in the sense that this is not asking me to go beyond this number of syllables or this number of lines? I know what I can say will be 5 lines long, and it will be.
I think it's sort of a slightly more extreme version of a sonnet, right? 5 lines, knowing it had to hit 5, 7, 5, 7, 7, and then again having the pleasure of sort of counting syllables. It just, once again, because the poems emerged all from me staring at the sea, either being at the beach or being at a friend's apartment where their window looks out onto the sea. And I found that so deeply moving, because Hong Kong's surrounded on 3 sides by the sea, and there were many days when I wanted to sort of be in the sea, but I couldn't because I was in the hospital. And so that longing for home as well, because I am based in the UK and I work here. And yet my parents are in a different country altogether. So I just realized the image of the sea was very potent. But then again, the sea, like a lot of images we use in grief, can be also very prone to cliche. So if one doesn't use these images carefully, it can feel very trite or melodramatic, or, I've heard this before, right? So the tanka form sort of helped me restrain myself a bit. And I think each line, each word really has to work very hard. And I had to think very hard, because if I'm already at like 20 syllables and I've only got 11 to go, I really need to be careful, right, with my choice of words. So I think that again was enabling and kind of helping me laser focus on what I was trying to say.
Yeah. So I've got one more question before I come to the audience. You quote, I thought you quoted 17 people, but then you mentioned Darren Leader, so there's 18. You quote 18 poets and writers. So your lecture is almost a mini anthology, and I'm sure they're some of your sort of favoured and sort of clung to poems. But do you feel part of something, because you edited the 100 Queer Poems anthology with Andrew Millen? Do you feel connected to other contemporary poets? Do you feel that there is a kind of international poetry scene, or a you were saying about elegy being resistant to being merely something that's going to comfort, and you're saying as if that's a kind of way. Do you feel part of something bigger, and can you identify it or name it?
I mean, I'm probably quoting too much within the space that I took up today, but I can't really write or think except through, the work of others. And, obviously we do that in academia, we cite people, but for me, it's more of a personal connection, right, to these works. A sense that I'm only the writer that I am because I have read these people, that their words have shaped how I see the world. They've shaped my poetics, and they continue to shape, my investigation of poetry. So I think, editing 100 Queer Poems was really liberating and wonderful, because it was during the pandemic, really, that Andrea Macmillan and I edited this anthology all over Zoom and WhatsApp. And when we were so isolated during the lockdowns, I could feel connected to these other poets, 100, well, a lot of them are dead, but also, in spirit, connected to a lineage of queer poets that I hadn't personally even been aware of myself. And And I do cite a lot of poets these days that are predominantly Anglo-American. And I think, funnily enough, at the Winchester Poetry Festival 2 weeks ago, I gave a talk on a poet called Bing Xin, who's a modern Chinese writer, essayist, and poet who I read when I was very young at school. And that was a chance for me to, I think, reclaim some of those voices that are not within the Anglo-American literary canon, but whom actually have shaped me. And so, yeah, I think I want to sort of feel more connected to a more global array of voices, going forwards.
And we can take the ones that you've included in the lecture as some of the closest, like Emily Berry and Carsten.
Yes, indeed.
So I'm going to first ask if we had any online questions, and we've got a roving mic as well.
Yes.
Yep. Which is going to rove.
Yes.
So there's one question, anonymous, online, which is the relationship between form and constraint for you. And if I could add on my own to it, which is that at some point you talked about linguistic compression. So in what way do you understand form, constraint, and language as pertaining to grief? So the question says, if grief always needs a form, otherwise it cannot be textualized.
For me, there are a few things. At times, I think I mentioned via Darren Leader and Emily Berry that sometimes grief feels that is beyond language, that we have no language for what's going on. And therefore, I think firstly, I turn to the works of others, which is why probably I cite so often in this lecture. But then through using other people's words, I also want to find my own. And in terms of writing a poem, through the sonnet, through the specular, through the sestina, again, because certain words have to almost be mandated, or they have to be used, right? In order to, for example, in the sestina, I haven't had time today to explore that, but you have to repeat those 6 N words, 6 times. And therefore, once I've committed to those 6 words, they have to recur. And so, that is the kind of form that then enables me to find a language that previously didn't exist, right? So if I've committed to the word house or mother, then that just has to keep coming back. And so for those who find it hard to, speak to something, then those words almost give you a prompt or a nudge towards, okay, now you have the word mother, keep going. You have the word house, what happens here? What happens in this house? And I'm thinking particularly of Elizabeth Bishop's Sestina, where there's a line that says, and the child draws another inscrutable house. And I just love this idea of what is an inscrutable house? But I sometimes wonder, had she not had the word house there, would she have written that line, the child draws another inscrutable house? So really form is something I've relied on a lot this year to talk about grief.
Is there another? Okay. Okay, so we've got a question at the very back. We will take a while to get to.
Hello, sorry. So I wrote it down. So you talk about the difficulty of expressing grief and then pull from this idea of imagining constraint through the language of I had. Your lecture uses this, I had to do this, I had to do this, which is very much kind of in my head an inclusionary constraint, I must include. And it kind of this idea of forcing you to confront and acknowledge its presence. And I kind of wondered if you've ever had poems that have failed in your head to observe constraint, but have enabled you to express something else. So in kind of their actual, sometimes the words have wanted to resist this form, and actually you've discovered something else about grief in the process.
Yeah, thank you so much. Did everyone hear the question? So yeah, this idea of a form failing to sort of materialize, but then it enabled me to say something. Yeah, for sure. And I'm not someone who believes in being sort of trapped by the form, as it were. Forms should be enabling. And I often tell my students as well, if you've tried to write, say, a sestina and it's not working, just break it open, just write something else. Or it could be a broken sestina. And indeed, sonnets nowadays, we have sonnets with 13 lines. you know, and that for me is very productive as well, because if a sonnet ends at line 13, it means that something isn't complete. There is no volta that ends with a rhyming couplet. So the idea of something left open, right? Or left, there's a gaping void there. That is indicating something with the form. Or if the poem goes on to 15 lines or 16 lines in a stretched sonnet, what does it mean that the poem has exceeded the 14-line limit, which is so kind of perfect? So that means that something is overflowing or overspilling. You know, so I find these kind of failed experiments very productive. And indeed, once you've decided that it is now something else, it is not a failure. It's simply the experiment having taken you in a different direction. Yeah. Thank you for that question.
Right, and I think there was one slightly closer.
Thank you. I think my question feel like adding it up, but I have to say something different. It's like I really enjoyed your voice, so beautiful, and now I think I start reading poems like imagine with your voice, imagine it in my brain, and yeah, it is very beautiful. And so my question is actually for this tanka, specific for the materialization of the form. My question is, since it's a Japanese version and you are using it in the English version of it, and you're using very standard English pronunciation for it, what if I imagined, maybe Scottish or Irish accent reading it? Will it change a little bit like syllabus to, ruin the form of it?
Oh, you mean sort of with the syllabic count. Yeah. I wonder. I mean, obviously, I don't speak Japanese, sadly. I only speak Chinese. So my only introduction to the tanka is through sort of English tankas, as it were. I'm not sure reading it in different English accents or different, would result in a different syllabic count. I don't think that would happen. But yeah, certainly. I mean, it is quite sonic. And the interesting thing is tanka and choka. In Chinese, it's 短歌 and 长歌, and so it basically means short song and long song. So the word song is inherent in the word poetry in Chinese and Japanese. So I find it quite interesting that it is a very sonic sort of form inherently. So yeah, I wonder. I mean, I'd be happy for other people to read it out loud and see what the effect would be. But yeah, thanks for your observation.
So I can see that you've constrained your grief into these different forms, right? So you mentioned something, it being like a mantra, right? Something you could repeat to yourself. Do you find that allows you to build and explore your grief in different ways? Or do you start going into the same thinking patterns again and again after creating this poetry?
To figure out what I think and to understand sort of experience. I find it much better than, say, writing my diary, because that can get very sort of, repetitive. But I also believe in poetry not just as sort of catharsis. It is an act of creation, right? It's an act of transformation. So really, once I've written this tanka, it isn't just about the original experience. I've created something new. And language for me always is transformative. So I found it, very helpful in being able to articulate something through poetry. It is like, someone going to a canvas and painting something, but the original impulse is still there, but the painting is now its own thing, right? So I don't feel like it sort of causes me to dwell, if that's what you're sort of wondering. Yeah, I find it becomes something else once I've written it down. I hope that answers your question, sort of. Or you could repeat or, follow up if you want. Yeah.
So I guess my question is that, so say for example, you have an experience which has caused you grief. So once you have, you've mentioned that, that the poetic form allows you to express your grief in a more succinct, distilled manner. But once you have had that experience and you've encapsulated it in a poem, do you think that you've now shelved away that experience? Now the experience is done with, and I don't need to think about it in any other way? Or do you think that there's something you can continuously revisit and build new things out of?
Sure. I think that, obviously I'm not trying to claim or overclaim anything for poetry. I'm not saying that once I've written these 3 tankas, I'm done with grieving. That is certainly not the case. I wish it were. And indeed, I hope to write a whole book of poems. So, I will continue to revisit these experiences and emotions. And I just think, poetry for me is the way I tend to approach experiences or thinking through them, just like others turn to different creative practices like making music or painting, etc. Yeah, so it's certainly not done. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. I sort of have the inverse of that question, which is like, if you are writing, say, something like a Sestina 7 months ago to now, how does the kind of changing of your feeling of grief change how you are relating to these different forms? So is it that I don't know, the kind of Sestina felt particularly useful in that moment for that feeling, but if you revisited now, it would maybe not be as enabling as you initially found it? I was just kind of thinking about the kind of changing of grief, right? Because grief is always shifting. And so how is that have you found that affecting your kind of use of the forms?
I think that's a great sort of observation. And indeed, I do believe in sort of the right form finding the feeling, So I am by no means saying, don't write in free verse. I have plenty of free verse poems, I have plenty of prose poems that require that capaciousness of, the entire A4 page. Yeah, I think poems, to be honest, they are snapshots of, moments in time, or they are sort of a particular glimpse of something. And I just think that, there's so many ways to write, especially these days. We have new poetic forms. We have people inventing forms all the time. There's the golden shovel, all these amazing forms with amazing names. And I can't quite keep up with, the different ways we are encouraged to write these days. So anything from historic forms like Sestina and Sonnet to things like the duplex, etc. I think it's invigorating. I think it's wonderful. So I'm always excited to try these new forms whenever they come up. And I also feel it's only fair because I tell my students to do them. I should try as well. So.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like I noticed an interest in place in a lot of your writing in particular places. And I was wondering if you could just, I guess I don't have a direct question, but I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about how you find yourself engaging with place and what place affords you in your writing.
Other than the fact that I have experienced these different settings that I set my poems in, place also has a lot to do with language, right? Like, for example, when I'm home in Hong Kong, I only predominantly speak in Cantonese or Mandarin. English also features, but that it becomes a sort of multilingual environment. And that actually makes me write differently, because I have the rhythms and sounds of Cantonese in my day-to-day life. And then actually, it does make me look at English in a slightly different light. It makes English a bit sort of estranged because I'm not sort of using it in a kind of colloquial sense every day. So that's how I kind of think about place through language. I also just find that specificity is so important. I don't want to write some kind of vague universal poem about a place that supposedly we can all imagine. But I find that the more vague you are, the less people can imagine it, actually. But if you say, this is this particular sea, this is this particular location, actually people can then imagine it, right? So I take it, inspiration from people like Seamus Heaney. When he writes, he's very specific about the location in which certain things take place, and yet we see him as a kind of universal poet. And I find specificity is so wonderfully universal, actually. And that's why I think place is quite important to me. Yeah. Actually, should we go here first and then?
which point written in any of your other languages? Because I'm curious if the output would change if you were writing in, say, Chinese Mandarin, than if you were trying to write in English.
Yeah, well, I should say that whilst Chinese is Cantonese and Mandarin are both languages I'm deeply familiar with. Cantonese is my mother tongue, and then I learned Mandarin separately. I've not written contemporary poems in Chinese, although recently I'm investigating whether I might try to translate a Chinese poet into English, and it could be a book-length project, but it's still very early days. So I think my sort of tiptoeing towards doing that would have to come through translation, partly because I've just been immersed in writing English poems over the past decade. And so I don't think I'm skilled enough really to write poems in contemporary Chinese. I would just have to revise and sort of revisit a lot of classical Chinese literature and contemporary Chinese literature to enrich myself in order to be able to do that well. Yeah, so I would say I'm just a novice at that, strangely enough, even though it's my mother tongue. Third question.
The same question.
Oh, similar.
That was my question.
Oh, okay. Wow, wonderful.
Also about the form and everything. It's like when you mentioned about writing the Chinese poem, I feel like the very famous of the Chinese poem one, 生推月下门 or 生敲月下门, which is like the poet was like struggling using which verb for finish that sentence. So my question is basically, writing these forms to me is like putting a math problem or math question in front of me, and what you are doing is like fill that Sudoku like in a beautiful and perfect way. So I was, and you have already said like when you are a student or you are having things, emotions cannot finish by the form, you encourage them to break the law. So,
Yeah, to break the
so,
form.
so I was like the math
Let me
question.
just be clear,
Break the
those weren't
form.
the exact words.
Sorry for the misunderstanding then. So I was thinking, it's kind of like the sense and sensibility collision together. So what will you prefer then? Like to finish the question first, or to show, because we are talking about the grief poem and the sorrow and all the feelings behind it. Yeah, I would like to know what will you think.
I think I'm slightly. Can you sort of rephrase that and then sort of say it once more in a slightly briefer way?
Yeah, it's sensibility, the form, and
Yeah.
your feelings.
Yes. So how do
you manage it?
Thank you for that question. I manage it through, I think it's so interesting because obviously for a talk like this, I'm showing you, well, firstly, the poems that I deem to have sort of worked. And they are examples of sort of me working with stricter forms, but there are so many poems where the feeling and the form don't mesh. I've been trying to edit this poem for days or weeks and months, been relineating it over and over. Initially it's in couplets, now it's in tercets, then it's suddenly like, oh, actually it should be a prose poem maybe. Yeah, there are lots of poems where I need to struggle to find the form, and sometimes I'm like, this poem doesn't work, and I'm just going to put it aside and let it be. And then years later, I might pluck out a few lines from that poem and it goes into another poem. And yeah. Yeah, it's sort of, I think it's like a form is basically just a kind of container. It's a way of, how should I put it? It's like you want the form not to work against you, right? So if the poem is about something very, I don't know, loose and sort of exciting, like dancing, for example, very bad example, then the form needs to be loose or capacious, right? And then vice versa, if it's a claustrophobic poem where there's a lot of heaviness, then something like the sonnet would work really well because it's kind of like a concrete block on the page. So it kind of creates that sense of claustrophobia. So it's just about form enabling content. And sometimes I don't know what the form should be. And so I tweak it and play with it. And the best thing about, writing is that nobody needs to see it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And then you just You don't have to tell people, oh, I wrote 10 bad poems today. You know, it's just you just put it aside, and yeah. So it's quite interesting. Like we don't really show the messiness of writing. And sometimes for certain talks, I do bring out, you know, especially when it's about practice, I bring out the failed, I wouldn't like to even call them failed. I bring out the previous versions. And then we can see how this poem's evolved over like 5 different versions and what I took out and how I relineated it. And, you know, so I think sometimes that's the truth of writing, is that it's very messy. It's not like this. Like this is because it needs to look good. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I think maybe we have time for one more question. If you haven't all entered Hive Mind and you're all thinking the same thing, oh, we've got 2.
Yeah.
So one at the back on the left and one at the back on the right. Thank you.
Testing. So you've spoken about how writing poetry and such has helped you process grief and understand it better. But do you also feel like that it helps lessen it, help you come to acceptance with your new reality?
Speaking, I do turn to poets myself as a reader for comfort and solace. So I would say that that's certainly true, that reading poetry helps me in living my life. Does poetry help lessen the grief? I'm kind of wary of that conclusion because I sort of I don't think writing is necessarily cathartic, and some people would even say it's difficult, right? Because you have to revisit something, you have to dwell on it, you have to agonize over it. But it's something I need to do. Does that make sense? It's like some people need to go running, and running can be painful and tiring and exhausting, but you need to run. And of course, it's healthy for you, you know. So for me, writing is something, it's a practice that I turn to because I need to do it. From quite a young age, I've known that regardless of what happens professionally, I will write, you know, for the rest of my life. Like writing is almost like something I need to be well, you know. So regardless of whether it's a difficult experience like grief or whether it's something joyful, I turn to writing. If that makes sense? Like writing to me is sort of the activity that I need to do in my life. So whether or not it helps, I hope so. Yeah, you know, I think again, writing this lecture was somehow difficult, but also it's helped me understand something, you know, it's helped me realize actually I'm very lucky to have something like writing in my life because it's sort of like a companion, you know, as you go through life, to have something to turn to, almost like a friend, you know, you can go to it when you're in need.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we have one more question on the far corner, of course.
Okay, thank you. So my question is also about form and content. I'm curious about your view of the conflicts between form and content, because to me, a form always has certain constraint on content. It kind of prohibits you from choosing certain words in a poem, and the feelings is the content is like kind of urge of feelings that they are crying to need a form. So I feel like, because you also mentioned you spent a whole night working on the sonnet, so I think why not we just abandon the form and choose whatever words we like. I want to hear your opinion. Thank you.
Yeah, and I think that's precisely maybe what I was trying to articulate today, is that, you know, I think grief can be firstly nebulous and unwieldy and overwhelming. So I don't even know where to start. Sometimes I don't have words for what I'm feeling. Also, I'm very well aware I'm writing a poem. Now, the thing is, I'm talking about poetry, right? So of course I can just go to my diary and just blurt it all out, or even draw or do whatever. The thing is, I want to write a poem that doesn't come across as cliched or melodramatic, right? Or overly sentimental, hyperbolic, etc. So I'm trying to write a poem within which language still feels new or surprising to the reader. And grief is a difficult topic, just like love, just like death, just like all the other perennial themes, is that because we've experienced this throughout, millennia, many people have written about these things. And so it's very hard to find new words, new ways of expressing the same feeling, right? So for me, poetic constraint is a way of accidentally coming across new words, new language, because of the constraints, because, oh, actually, I need to rhyme something with my, what should that word be, right? Obviously within the parameters of me trying to say something. So not just letting the form lead me astray per se, but, precisely when I'm trying to innovate and be innovative with language, the form can help me think differently because there's a constraint there. And if it were just a free verse poem, I would just use the same old words that I already have in my mind, because that's what we do, right? We reach for the easy words. We reach for the easy metaphors, the easy similes, because they're there. Just in my head, I could come up with a bunch of things that are very boring. So I'm trying not to be boring effectively. Yeah, that's why poetic constraint can be quite helpful and innovating, I think.
Thank you very.
Thank you. Thank you all for your questions. Thank you for those who've attended online too. Recording of this is going to be available for you to watch again. We will put it up on our YouTube. If you're interested in exploring some of these questions yourself, then you're more than welcome to email me if you would like to study here. If you're not studying here already, I see much of our postgraduate community is here. Thank you for coming. As I said before, I'm going to be selling Flesh and Bright Fear. I knew how that was going to sound. I just delivered it so deadpan. Yeah. It's more than £1 though. I'm going to be. I can't come back from that. You know what I mean. Poetry. You can buy poetry from me outside that's been written by our extraordinary speaker, and I wouldn't miss the opportunity if I were you. You will regret it in years to come. Thank you again for coming, and I will end there. But I would like to just get you to give another round of applause to Dr. Mary Jean Flanner.